It's headlined, How Israeli Drone Strikes Are Killing Journalists in Gaza. It reports survivor testimonies and audiovisual analysis reveal a pattern of strikes by Israeli UAVs on Palestinian journalists in recent months, even when they're clearly identifiable as press. So you've covered WikiLeaks, you've talked about their work in Iraq and Afghanistan, and you have written extensively about Gaza. Can you talk about that, this latest report?
Well, what's so shocking really since October 7 is that there's more journalists killed by Israel and Gaza than any conflict in decades. In fact, I think pretty much any time in recorded history in the last 30 years. And that, I think, goes to the heart of how Israel views Palestinian journalists. They actually don't view them as journalists. They don't view them as people who deserve protection, regardless of the vests, regardless of what work they're doing. They see them as akin to terrorists. And that's clear based on that recent reporting you just mentioned, Amy, but also various other reports, including journalists that I've spoken to in Gaza in the last months and journalists I've spent time with in Gaza in the last 15 years, that Israel regards really so many Palestinians as legitimate targets. You don't kill, as Israel has, 40 to 50,000 Palestinians, the vast majority of whom are civilians, if you don't regard mass slaughter as the point. That is the point. The point is to kill not every single Palestinian in Gaza, but to kill huge amounts of Palestinians, including journalists, reporters. And it's interesting how since October 7, as we know, not one foreign journalist has entered Gaza. In fact, one has been there very briefly from CNN. But aside from her, no one has. And Palestinian journalists have been our eyes and ears, even though the death toll is unprecedented. And yet, despite that, there is still a sense of many in the Western elite and, frankly, Western press still not regarding Israel akin to, say, Russia. Russia is easily regarded as a rogue state because of its actions in, say, Ukraine. And yet somehow when we talk about Israel, who, by the way, has killed more journalists in Gaza than Russia's ever killed in Ukraine, somehow we treat Israel differently in some circles. The US certainly does, much of Europe certainly does, my country, Australia, does. So I think that kind of complete unaccountability within Israel is something that is going to haunt it for many years to come. There'll be court cases, and many Israeli leaders are going to find that they will not be able to go to certain countries because of possible prosecution or worse. And that's welcome. And WikiLeaks, I think, has shown in some ways a model of how there needs to be accountability and protection of journalists, because we are at a period in history now where journalists are under more threat than really ever before. Obviously, Gaza is the obvious example, but elsewhere, Ukraine, Sudan, Congo, and elsewhere.
And Anthony, along that vein, I wanted to ask you about the hypocrisy of the press in the United States and in the West in general, that many of these media outlets are using footage from Gaza that these Palestinian journalists are largely almost totally producing, and yet they're remaining silent about the killing of journalists by the Israelis.
And that really goes to the heart of so much of the American press. I mean, I was thinking in the last month, this White House Correspondents' Dinner, this kind of joke of journalists getting together, palling around with Joe Biden. They talk about the importance of press freedom. What they did not talk about at that dinner a few months ago were two key things: WikiLeaks and Julian Assange, who obviously was still in Belmarsh then in London, and journalists in Gaza who are being slaughtered on massive scale by Israel. I mean, the idea that an American media outlet would not give the same kind of credit or presence of Gazan journalists, Palestinian journalists, to others in other countries, it really speaks, I think, to the heart of, I think there is still this real contempt and, frankly, racism at the heart of many in the American press. That, not all, of course, obviously, but in many circles there is still this unwillingness to actually recognise not just Palestinians as human beings, Palestinians as deserving protection, but Palestinian journalists demanding accountability. I mean, where is the New York Times or the Washington Post or all these other outlets? As you say, Juan, without these Palestinian journalists, we would not have any vision in Gaza. There are no Western journalists in Gaza, and yet we rely on Palestinian journalists who have been beyond heroic in the last 8+ months. And I think it really goes to the heart of how so many people, particularly younger Americans and younger people generally, regard so many people in the mainstream press with contempt. That's why they're getting their information often, not from the New York Times, the Washington Post, they're getting them from social media or elsewhere, which is why I think so many young people view what's happening in Gaza and the genocide going on there as generationally defining. This is not something Israel can come back from.
Anthony Lowenstein, we want to thank you for being with us from Sydney, Australia, independent journalist, longtime supporter of WikiLeaks, and Assange had taken political asylum to interview him. He'd been holed up there for more than 2 years at that point, having received political asylum from the government of Ecuador, but could not make it to Ecuador without being arrested. Toward the end of our interview, I asked Julian Assange, what gives you hope and what do you see as the greatest legacy of WikiLeaks? This was Julian's response.
Well, hopefully the greatest legacy is still to come, but WikiLeaks started in 2007, but it was really this very public confrontation that we had in 2010, 2011, which people saw watching. So it was not... A new generation saw history unfolding in real time before their eyes, a history that they were part of. Young people see the internet as their place, where they exchange ideas and culture and so on. And previously they had been politically apathetic because they didn't feel that they could be a part of the power process. But seeing Hillary Clinton's personal cables and equivalents from many different countries and the fight that we were in and being part of that in some way by spreading this information or talking about it with others educated a new generation. And the internet went from being a politically apathetic space to being a political space. And that then spread into many different things. And so I think this is actually the most significant thing that we have done. We have also, in terms of the publishing industry, widened the envelope of what is acceptable to publish and so on. That's been quite important, and set off a cascade of examples which are going through allegedly Chelsea Manning and Edward Snowden and Jeremy Hammond and many others to come forward and reveal abuses in government.
Is there another Edward Snowden in the pipeline?
I'm sure there will be. In fact, I'm sure there already is.
So that's Julian Assange.